Chapter 1. The Voice in the Empty Chair. The rain had not merely arrived. It had taken possession of the little seaside town of Brindlesea, driving the gulls inland and flattening the grass upon the headlands. It came down in long, hissing sheets against the tall windows of the Seaforth Hotel, blurring the once proud view of the gray sea until the horizon itself dissolved into a single indistinct smear. Inside the grand lounge, paneled in dark walnut and scented faintly of pipe smoke and brine, was a little world unto itself, where the fire glowed with the stubborn pride of an old establishment determined to keep up appearances. On that particular evening, a curious assembly had gathered in the lounge. Lady Evelyn Markham, widowed these 5 years, yet dressed in a manner suggesting the occasion was perpetually formal, sat by the hearth with her hands folded neatly in black gloves. Mr. Colin Drake, a well-fed man in his late 50s with complexion of someone accustomed to port and long dinners, busied himself at the writing desk, his pen moving quickly over thick cream paper. Nearby, Miss Clara Vane, the young pianist who was engaged to perform in the hotel's dining room later in the week, lounged with a sheet of music on her lap, tapping out notes in the air with a distracted hand. What bound them together, however, was not mere social happenstance. It was the anticipation of the evening's event. For the Seaforth Hotel was hosting a private séance, arranged at the special request of one Mrs. Theodora Blackwell, a woman of striking presence and vague origins, who had lately taken the town's idle wealthy by storm with her claims of communing with the departed. The séance had been scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock in the smaller drawing room. 8 chairs had been placed in a circle, each with a single candle before it, and in the center, an antique table carved with strange, curling motifs. The guests had been carefully selected, half by Mrs. Blackwell, half by Lady Evelyn, and each believed they had their own private reason for attending. Some sought comfort, others curiosity, and at least one, it would later be revealed, sought something far darker. At 5 minutes past 8, Mrs. Blackwell swept into the room. She wore a gown of deep violet, and her black hair was drawn up in a way that gave her head an almost statuesque height. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, passed over the assembled guests before resting upon an empty chair at the far side of the circle. "Ah," she said, her voice low and carrying. "Mr. Armitage has not yet arrived. We shall wait one moment longer. The spirits are impatient when the circle is incomplete." But Mr. Armitage did not arrive. At 10 past 8, Mrs. Blackwell inclined her head and took her seat, instructing the others to join hands. The candles trembled in the draught from the fireplace, shadows pressing in as the room grew still. She began her murmured invocations, her voice dipping and rising like the tide, when a voice came from the empty chair. It was deep, rasping, and unmistakably male. The words, however, were indistinct, as though carried from a distance. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by Lady Evelyn's gloved hand clutching at the one beside her. Mrs. Blackwell did not flinch. "You are among friends," she said softly. "You may speak." The voice came again, clearer this time. "The debt unpaid, the sea will take." Miss Clara Vane gave a little cry, her sheet of music sliding to the floor. Mr. Drake's pen rolled from his fingers. And then silence. When the candles were relit and the curtains drawn back, the empty chair was found to bear a strange, irregular stain upon the upholstery, dark and damp to the touch. But more shocking still was the news that came moments later from the porter. Mr. Armitage had been found dead in his room upstairs, lifeless in a chair identical to the one downstairs, a small trickle of seawater pooling at his feet. By midnight, the hotel's genteel atmosphere was gone, replaced with a brittle hush of whispered conjecture and hurried footsteps. The local inspector, a stocky man with little patience for mediums' nonsense, began making his inquiries. And somewhere quietly, word had already reached a certain fastidious Belgian who, though he did not yet know it, would soon be standing in that drawing room, gazing thoughtfully at the empty chair where a dead man's voice had spoken. Chapter 2. The First Clues. Inspector Harold disliked to see in the way men dislike a witness that cannot be squared. It had a habit of turning up at scenes where it did not belong, under bedroom chairs, for instance, and then folding itself away into silence and blank horizons. He stood now in room 212 of the Seaforth Hotel, the door propped open, the corridor politely emptied, and took in the stillness with practiced eye. Mr. Armitage, Percival Armitage, as his leather portmanteau announced, sat as if listening to something he could not quite make out. His chin was lowered. His mouth had slackened into a crescent of surprise. There was no violence visible, no disorder. Merely that rivulet of brine that crept from the hem of his trouser leg to the polished floorboards and pooled beneath the chair as though the sea had been smuggled up the staircase in a bucket and then forgotten. Dr. Selby? Harrow said quietly. The town physician, slender and precise, knelt beside the body with the weary delicacy of a man who dislikes the interruption of his supper. He had performed his examinations, the pulse that would not oblige, the pupils that would not answer, and now he peered at the skin at Armitage's temple, lifting a lamp to change the angle of the light. No obvious trauma, he murmured. No frothing at the mouth. Lividity and temperature suggest death within the hour prior to discovery. Say between 7:45 and 8:45, to be generous. Harrow tilted his head toward the puddle. And that doctor? Selby tapped the chair leg with his pencil. Salt water. I can smell it. There are crystals drying at the seam of the upholstery. The window? Harrow asked. The porter, a freckled young man named Tom with a painfully straight posture, had already opened and closed it twice under the inspector's direction, as though the casement might confess on the second attempt. Latched from the inside. Sir, an old latch, stiff but firm. No sign it's been forced. Harrow stepped to the window and looked down into the rain-smeared darkness. 2 stories below, the narrow service lane ran along the western side of the hotel. Beyond it, the headland fell away toward the blacker strip that was the sea. The glass smelled faintly of coal soot and the damp that creeps into it over years. He ran a finger along the sill. Grit clung to his skin, fine and stubborn, like a beach brought indoors. He rubbed it against his thumb and considered the small domesticity of the bedside table. A glass with a half-inch of water, a folded square paper with a penciled column of numbers, a hotel envelope stamped with the Seaforth crest and left unsealed. He glanced at the envelope and saw the beginnings of a letter in a clear, disciplined hand. Seaforth Hotel, Monday evening. Beneath that, Mrs. Blackwell insists upon the demonstration tonight. I have agreed, though I distrust her methods. The sentence broke off. The nib had scored a ragged line across the paper where the writer's attention, or his life, had failed. What time was Mr. Armitage last seen? Harrow asked. Tom swallowed. I carried up his dinner tray, sir. 7:30. He was dressed. Hadn't changed for bed. He asked me if the drawing-room was ready for the séance. I said, yes, ma'am, sir, that is... And after that? No one came up until I found him, sir. Mrs. Blackwell sent me for more candles at 8:30. She's particular about the light. I took them down to the small drawing-room. When I came back to the desk, Mr. Penrith, our manager, asked me to check on a complaint about a dripping noise in this corridor. I came up a little after 9. That's when I saw the wet under the door. Harrow turned to the corridor. Even in the dull carpet, there was an insinuation of damp that gathered in a darker seam along the baseboard near room 212. He crouched and laid his palm against the skirting. It was not soaked, merely kissed by moisture. The inspector rose and motioned to the maid who hovered at the threshold, twisting her apron. Elsie, is it? He said. She bobbed and gnawed. Sir, did you go into Mr. Armitage's room this evening? No, sir. Not after I turned down the bed at 6. He wasn't in then. He'd left the book open on the chair. Harrow looked at the chair again. The book now lay on the desk, spine cracked, Tidal Tides and Navigation of the Channel. He lifted it with 2 fingers, opened it at random, and found a page underlined in pencil. The voice of the sea is measured not by the ear, but by the change in scribes in the shore. Margin note in the same neat hand. Debt in another language. He closed the book. Downstairs, the hotel had become a series of islands separated by corridors of quiet conspiracy. Guests prefer to cluster in pairs near the fire or disappear entirely, and servants move with that theatrical delicacy that announces to itself it has nothing to conceal. Harrow walked the length of the small drawing-room, now bright, drafts cuffed out by relit flames, and paused at the circle of chairs, 8 in number. In front of the chair that stood empty, the candle had guttered and then bled down the side in a peculiar finning of wax. as though a breath had caught it from a low angle. On the seat lay a small satin-edged handkerchief, damp with the same briny smell that haunted room 212. "Who left this here?" Harrow asked, lifting the corner of the cloth. Mrs. Theodora Blackwell materialized between the curtains as if a stage manager were cueing her entrance. Even with her coiffure slightly disordered by the rain, she held herself as though a balcony were beneath her and an audience beyond it. "No one left it, Inspector," she said, her voice low and beautifully pitched. "It was not there when we began. The spirits leave tokens. It is not uncommon." Harrow let the handkerchief fall back to the chair. "And the voice was not Mr. Armitage's," she replied without hesitation. "I have conducted many circles. I know when the dead speak." This voice had the strain of an older bitterness. Lady Evelyn Markham forestalled a skeptical remark by arriving at Harrow's elbow with apologetic haste. "Inspector, if you need an account, I shall give one. I confess I thought the voice a theatrical trick until the porter came. Then I was merely unwell." "You were the one who insisted upon the séance," Harrow said mildly. She kept her gaze on the empty chair. "I did. I believe Mrs. Blackwell has a gift, and there are some debts," her gloved hands folded, "that awake one's curiosity." Across the room, Colin Drake had taken up position by the mantel as if it were a business he owned, his fleshy hands spread to the fire. He summoned a comfortable smile when Harrow addressed him, but there was damp at his cuffs that had no business there if a gentleman's evening had passed entirely indoors. "Damned odd business," he said. "Armitage and I are acquainted, casually. Insurance man, you know, of the better sort. No quibbling over pennies. Came down for sea air. He told me. I did the same." "And the voice?" Harrow asked. "Could have been a ventriloquist behind the curtain for all I know," Drake said with an easy burble. "No offense meant, Mrs. Blackwell. I'm a practical man." Miss Clara Vane, who had been at the piano stool tracing the air with invisible notes, looked over with an eagerness that did not disguise her pallor. "It said something about the sea and a debt," she ventured. "It sounded tired. Like my father on the nights, he could not sleep. He was a fisherman." "Your hands are shaking, Miss Vane," Harrow observed. She tucked them beneath the score. "It is the weather, Inspector, and the talk. I don't like voices where no one sits." Harrow's gaze slid to the writing desk where Drake had been earlier. A hotel blotter bore the ghost of a sentence impressed from heavy pen strokes. Not tonight. The ledger, then the indentation, wandered into a scribble. He laid the paper flat and angled the lamp until blind writing rose in relief. "We do not speak of the ledger tonight. It is not safe." There was no signature, and the paper beneath had been torn away. He looked up. "Who sat where?" he asked. Mrs. Blackwell indicated each chair with a gracious nod. "Here, myself. At my right, Mr. Drake. Then Miss Vane. The empty chair there for Mr. Armitage. Lady Evelyn opposite me. Captain Julian North, retired naval officer, at her side." Mr. Penrith, the manager, allowed himself to be persuaded to complete the circle, and the maid, Elsie, to ensure no one would accuse us of extinguishing candles unobserved. Harrow considered the symmetry of it, then bent to the candle before the empty chair. The puddle of wax had spilled in a fan to the left, though the nearest draft would have driven it back and away. He cupped his hand and breathed gently from different angles, watching the flame lean and the wax run. The shape he achieved was never quite the same as the one hardened before him. He straightened and studied the damp stain on the upholstery. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, "at any point did you or anyone leave the circle?" Her brows lifted, astonishment done with taste. "Inspector, you do not know me. I do not permit such vulgarities during a sitting." We held hands from invocation to the moment the voice ceased. "Yet at some point," Harrow said, a handkerchief appeared on a chair reserved for a man who was not present, and upstairs a trickle of seawater gathered itself politely at a dead man's feet. "You will forgive me if I call that vulgar." A small tide of color lifted in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "Call it what you wish. The world is larger than your ledger facts." The manager, Mr. Penrith, had arrived with his keys jangling gently like an apology. He was a careful man whose hair retreated from worry rather than age. "Inspector," "If there is anything you require," he began, "the hotel is entirely at your disposal. Our reputation—" "Reputations, Mr. Penrith," Harrow said, "are the most delicate part of any establishment." He lowered his voice. "Do your maids carry seawater indoors for any purpose?" Penrith blinked. "Seawater? No. We have baths on each floor. The only water carried is tea and soup. The boilers. Oh, there was a complaint at 9 of a dripping in the second-floor corridor. I sent the porter to investigate. He reported nothing. That is, the dripping had ceased." Harrow thanked him and walked the corridor once more. The carpet held no clear footprint. The pile rebounded from such small trespasses. But at the far end, near the service stairs, the skirting again showed that lazy darkening where damp lingers after things that has escaped notice. He put his ear to the wall and heard nothing but the steady tick of pipes in their channels. On the stair treads, he found one narrow crescent of sand clinging in a place where the mop cannot easily reach. Back in 212, he had the porter carry down the chair. On its underside, the tack head showed a tiny bloom of rust, fresh as though the salt had woken them. In the wastebasket, beneath a crisp curl of stationery, he found 3 coarse grains that glittered unhelpfully when he tipped them into his palm. Salt crystals, no larger than the head of a pin. He stood a long moment between the bed and the window, his hands clasped behind him. He saw again the circle of chairs below, the angles of wax, the neat unfinished letter, Drake's damn cuffs, Lady Evelyn's calm, gloved hands, Miss Vane's tremor, Mrs. Blackwell's velvet certainty, the sea beating itself into silence beyond the glass. "All right," he said at last, more to the room than to the men in it. "We shall have them in the morning in the lounge, each in turn and together. Tonight, lock the drawing-room and post a man at the door. Nothing moves in or out. And if it rains, let it rain. Perhaps it will wash away what it brought with it." He looked once more at the chair. The puddle at its foot had shrunk to a rim of damp, retreating like a tide that knew its hour had passed. Downstairs a door closed, a murmur rose, and somewhere in the hotel a piano gave 3 soft, uncertain notes as though a hand had brushed in passing. The inspector left the room with his dislike of the sea undiminished and his curiosity awakened. In the morning, there would be names, histories, and the agreeable tangle of human motives. For the present, he carried with him 2 stubborn facts. A voice had spoken where no man sat, and a dead man had brought the sea into his room as neatly as if it were a guest on a register. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Morning in Brindlesea came reluctantly, dragging a pale, reluctant sun across a sky the color of tarnished pewter. The rain had eased to a fine, persistent mist that hung over the headland and made the sea appear closer than it truly was. The Seaforth Hotel, however, had already shaken itself into that peculiar blend of bustle and hush that follows a night of misfortune. Breakfast service proceeded with all the usual silver covers and polished teapots, but conversation was low, eyes shifted quickly, and the scrape of cutlery seemed somehow indecent. Inspector Harrow had commandeered the corner of the lounge, where the walnut panels and heavy curtains muffled outside sounds. A fire burned steadily in the grate, giving the room a kind of conspiratorial warmth. One by one, the guests from the séance had been summoned, not under formal terms of arrest, but with a politely insistent phrasing that made refusal awkward. He intended to hear them all, but before that, he wished to observe them together. At precisely 9:30, the group assembled. Lady Evelyn Markham entered first, her black gloves exchanged for a softer dove-gray pair, but her composure intact. She chose a seat where the light from the window fell neatly across her face, giving the impression, Harrow noted, that she wished her expressions to be read clearly, or perhaps misread convincingly. Mr. Colin Drake arrived next, bearing the faint odor of cologne hastily applied and a face arranged into the expression of a man who wishes to be helpful but not unduly involved. His gold watch chain glinted as he took the armchair nearest the fire, nodding affably to Lady Evelyn but not quite meeting her eye. Miss Clara Vane slipped in quietly, her music folio clutched like a shield. She chose a low-backed chair at the far end, her gaze drawn repeatedly toward the rain-pearl windows. The pallor from the night before had not left her. There was a faint shadow under her eyes that might have been from lack of sleep or from something more pressing. Mrs. Theodore Blackwell's entrance had the deliberate timing of a stage cue. She wore a deep green velvet suit, her hair coiled high, her rings catching the lamplight as she removed her gloves finger by finger. She greeted Harrow as though they were co-investigators in some higher mystery, then settled with unhurried grace into the center of the group, where her presence seemed to draw all eyes. Captain Julian North arrived last among the guests. Tall, with a stiff back bearing a man who had once commanded decks and now commanded only his own dignity, he wore a navy blazer with brass buttons and held his cap in both hands. His eyes were the gray of ship's steel, and though he greeted the others politely, there was a guardedness in his manner that suggested he had already taken stock of the situation and found it disagreeable. Mr. Penrith, the hotel manager, entered with an apologetic air and sat near the door, his ledger tucked under one arm. The young porter, Tom, remained just outside, ready to be summoned if needed. Harrow took a moment to let the scene settle, the rustle of clothing and the shifting of chairs forming a brief overture. He noted how quickly certain glances were exchanged. Lady Evelyn to Mrs. Blackwell, Mrs. Blackwell to Captain North to Drake, and how quickly they were withdrawn. "You were all present last night in the drawing room at the time of the unusual occurrence," Harrow began, his voice even, "and you are all, in one way or another, connected to the late Mr. Percival Armitage. Before I speak to each of you privately, I should like to understand the nature of those connections, however slight." Mrs. Blackwell inclined her head first. "Mr. Armitage was known to me through mutual acquaintances in London. He attended one of my private demonstrations there. I did not know he was staying here until 2 days ago, when we encountered each other in the lounge. He expressed interest in joining my séance. That is all." Lady Evelyn's gloved hands rested lightly in her lap. "I met Mr. Armitage some years ago at a charity dinner in town. He was an intelligent conversationalist, though I cannot say we were intimate friends. Our meetings were always social, never private." Drake shifted in his seat. "As I told you last night, Inspector, he was an insurance man of a reputable firm. He handled a matter for me, a claim after my warehouse suffered a fire 2 years back. Efficient fellow. We'd see each other at the club now and then." Miss Vane's turn came reluctantly. "I only knew his name from the hotel register. We were not acquainted. He did ask me, in passing, what I thought of séances. I told him they unsettled me." Her voice wavered slightly, and Harrow noted Mrs. Blackwell's quick glance in her direction. Captain North's reply was clipped. "Met him here 2 days ago. We spoke of the sea. He seemed to have read widely on maritime matters for a man who, as far as I could tell, had never served." "And you, Mr. Penrith?" Harrow asked. "As manager, I knew Mr. Armitage as I know all our guests," Penrith replied, smoothing the cover of his ledger. "Courteous, punctual with his account, not inclined to complaint." Harrow let the silence rest just long enough for unease to settle. "Then it is curious, is it not, that a man with so little cause to disturb the peace of others should die under such peculiar circumstances in a hotel whose doors and windows were all, as far as we can tell, secured against intrusion?" Mrs. Blackwell's gaze sharpened. "You imply that someone here—" "I imply nothing at present," Harrow said smoothly. "But the facts compel me to consider possibilities." Captain North leaned forward. "You will not find me in sympathy with such performances as we endured last night, Inspector. Voices in empty chairs, handkerchiefs appearing as if from the ether. It is trickery, plain and simple. Trickery that coincided precisely with Mr. Armitage's death." Harrow reminded him, "Which is why I must ask, did anyone notice if the chair reserved for him was moved, touched, or otherwise interfered with during the sitting?" No one spoke at once. Then Miss Vane, hesitating, said, "The candle in front of it. The flame bent strangely, as if someone breathed on it, but we were all holding hands." "Indeed," Harrow said softly, his gaze moving from one face to another. "And yet there's a damp handkerchief on that chair, a patch of briny water upstairs, and no account for how either came to be." Lady Evelyn's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Inspector, you are suggesting a kind of sleight of hand. But to what end? Mr. Armitage was not a man with enemies. At least, not here." Harrow's eyes rested on her a moment longer than necessary. "That," he said, "is precisely what I intend to discover." He dismissed the group for now, indicating that individual interviews would begin shortly. As they filed out, Harrow noted their order, Drake lingering to exchange a word with Penrith. Mrs. Blackwell pausing at the door to murmur something to Lady Evelyn, Miss Vane slipping away almost guiltily, and Captain North moving with the deliberate pace of a man avoiding any appearance of haste. When the lounge was empty save for Harrow and the fire, the inspector allowed himself a slow exhalation. He now had in one room a collection of individuals who, on the surface, had little reason to wish Armitage harm. And yet, he thought of the damp cuffs, the unfinished letter, the ledger's whisper mention, the tide mark on the chair, and the voice speaking of debts. Somewhere in the civilized arrangement of polished manners and polite denials, there was a motive. He only needed to find the first thread to pull. And when he did, he suspected the whole neat weave of their alibis would begin to fray. Chapter 4. Poirot Arrives. There are entrances that are merely punctual, and entrances that are quietly theatrical. Hercule Poirot's arrival at the Seaford Hotel, that late Brindlesea morning, contrived to be both. A taxi pulled up beneath the dripping portico with the modest ceremony of a hearse that is decided, after all, to deliver flowers. The driver leapt round to open the door, but Poirot was already out, umbrella precisely angled to avoid a single droplet touching the brim of his hat, shoes planted as neatly as punctuation on the wet flagstones. He paused only to glance at the sea, as one might glance at a distant acquaintance whose manners one does not entirely trust, then stepped into the lobby. His coat was pale gray, his tie a decisive green, and a gardenia trembled in his buttonhole without daring to fall apart. He removed his gloves with the same attentive care he might have applied to disarming a bomb, then allowed the manager, Mr. Penrith, to approach with a series of anxious little bows. Poirot, Penrith began, "We are honored." Poirot's smile was small and exact. "But of course, you communicated the facts with clarity, monsieur. There's a dead gentleman, there's an empty chair, and there's a sea attempting, how do you say, to impose its personality in a hotel that did not invite it. Where's Inspector Harrow?" "In the lounge, sir. He, asked that you join him the moment you arrived." "Très bien." Poirot's gaze traveled the lobby with idle curiosity and returned, unstartled, to a faint trail of damp that darkened the carpet runners to the service corridor. "One moment," he said. He took from his pocket a little folded paper, no more than a scrap, and, kneeling with surprising grace for a man of his dignity, pressed it into the nap. He lifted it and examined the mark. "Salt," he murmured, more to himself than to Penrith. "It clings, even when it pretends to have gone." He crossed to the lounge, where Inspector Harrow rose with a look that combined relief and a professional skepticism he did not trouble to conceal. They had met before, sufficiently often that a modest respect had established itself between them like an agreed truce. "Thank you for coming down," Harrow said, offering his hand. "I wasn't sure the business would tempt you." "The business tempts me always," Poirot replied, laying his hat just so upon a side table and aligning it with the table's edge. "But the manner of the business, that is where there is flavor. You wrote of a seance, of a voice that came where there was no man, and of water from the sea that arrived as modestly as a guest who pays his bill. I am tempted." Harrow's mouth twitched despite himself. "You'll have your fill of flavor, I expect. Come, I'll show you the room first." They went to 212. Poirot stood just inside the threshold, as if refusing to permit the room to disturb his silhouette, and regarded the setting with his head slightly on one side. He said nothing at once. He inspected the window and the latch, with 2 fingers only, as though the latch might take offense at clumsiness. He took one delicate step toward the chair where Armitage had sat and stopped, directing his gaze not to furniture, but the absence of its drama, the slight dulling of the floorboards where the puddle had dwindled, the faint tightening of the wood at the lower jamb where damp had recoiled. "You have moved the chair?" he asked. "For examination, yes," Harrow said. "We brought it down and then had it returned." Nothing was found beyond a blush of rust on the tacks, and a few grains of salt. "And the bed was turned down at 6. Poirot said, "Not quite a question." The maid did not return. "Eh bien, the gentleman," he wrote. Harrow offered the unfinished letter and the hotel envelope. Poirot read silently, eyes narrowing, lips pressing together at the ragged line where the pen had skated. He replaced the paper precisely as he'd found it, then drifted to the bedside table, pausing at the glass with its measure of water. He lifted it, sniffed, sipped the smallest possible amount, and made a face. "This one is ordinary," he said. "Taste of pipes, not of ocean. So, in this room there are two waters, one that came because a man was thirsty, and one that came because some other person wished to appear mysterious. Always I distrust the second sort. It is like a lady who wears too much perfume. She wishes to distract from something that does not please." Harrow suppressed a smile. "You like the drawing room. Then, plenty of perfume." Presently, Poirot said, almost cheerfully. He set the glass down and bent to the carpet by the door. "Here you had the damp that visited and then retreated. It is discreet. It hides in the fiber. It does not stamp about. The sea, you understand, it is not so courteous. When it comes indoors, it leaves trails as clumsy as a child. But this is a visitor who knows the habits of carpets. You think someone carried seawater up?" Harrow asked. "I think, mon ami, that water does not conduct seances, and it does not choose the chairs. A human mind does these things. Let us go to the human minds." In the lounge, Harrow had arranged the interviews to begin at 10. The clock had not yet chimed, so Poirot allowed himself the small luxury of looking at the room where the circle had been. Penrith unlocked the drawing-room door with solemnity usually reserved for wine cellars. The 8 chairs remained as they had been left. The candles, now cold monuments of pale wax, the stain on the empty chair faint as a bruise in daylight. Poirot stood for a long 20 seconds, seeing nothing and everything. He moved to the candle before the empty chair and examined the finning of wax, tracing the irregular run with an immaculate forefinger held just above its surface. "From low and to the left," he murmured, "but with patience, not a gust that passes, a breath that persists." Mrs. Theodora Blackwell appeared in the doorway as if materializing from velvet curtains. "M. Poirot," she said with unusual softness, "one hears of you even with a dead whisper." Poirot bowed the exact measure, due to a lady who has complimented him extravagantly. "Madam," he said, "one hears also of you. You have the talent, if not to disturb the dead, then to disturb very much the living. This is a talent also." She smiled with a careful humility. "I do not perform tricks." "Nor do I," Poirot said pleasantly. "And yet, often persons accuse me of them. It is because, when one does not know how a thing is done, one says, 'Voila, it is magic.' But always, to jurors, it is only the psychology. You will allow me to question you later?" "With pleasure," she said, though the word did not entirely warm her eyes. By the hour, the suspects had reassembled in the lounge. Harrow introduced each by name. Poirot observed each by temperament. Lady Evelyn, whose composure was a costume she had long ago learned to wear as comfortably as silk. Mr. Drake, whose bonhomie pooled in a manner of gravy, rich and obscuring. Miss Clara Vane, with a tremble subdued now into a taut readiness, like a string tuned a quarter turned too tight. Captain North, whose honesty presented itself like a challenge coin on a bar, clean, bright, a little ostentatious. And Penrith, anxious to be neutral in a matter that did not understand neutrality. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said with the chirp of good humor that so often disguised a scalpel, "I am very sorry for the disturbance to your holiday. You will forgive me if I ask a question that may seem, how do you say domestic? But it is by the small domesticities that murder most often announces itself. We don't yet have a murder," Harrow put in coolly. "Cause of death pending." Poirot inclined his head. "But we have certainly the intention to astonish. It is rarely innocent." He began not with accusation, but with observation. "Lady Evelyn, you sit where the light is good. This is wise. It says, 'Look, I hide nothing,' and often it is true. Yet the hands, yesterday they were in black, today in gray. The shade softens the impression. You wish to be read precisely, but on your terms." Her smile acknowledged a hit without conceding ground. If one is to be studied, one prefers decent lighting. M. Poirot. "Just so." He turned, Monsieur Drake, last night the cuffs were damp. Today they are very dry. In Brindlesea, this is an achievement. Drake's laugh came a fraction too loud. I had an accident with the decanter, if you must know. Ah, but of course. And Mademoiselle Vane, your hands now do not shake. You have slept? A little, she said, chin lifting. I practice. For the music or for the questions? For both, she said, surprising him with the steadiness of her answer. Captain North, Poirot said gently. When a candle guttered, you did not turn your head. You fixed on the center of the table, as a helmsman fixes, on the point beyond the bow. You do not like to be made a fool. It is a common dislike, sir, North returned. And yet, Poirot continued, in a circle of hands, to be rigid is to be conspicuous. One feels the strain in the grip. To whom were you connected? Lady Evelyn and Mr. Penrith, the captain said. Eh bien, Poirot murmured. And you, Monsieur Penrith. You completed the circle because without you the number was 7, which is in the seances a number unsatisfactory to the theatrical ear. You are a man who likes propriety. Why, then, a seance at all in your respectable lounge? Penrith flustered. Mrs. Blackwell's gatherings were quite the fashion. Lady Evelyn requested it. We'd accommodate our patrons. And Mr. Armitage? Poirot said, at last allowing the name to settle like a gull on the room. He was to sit here. He touched the back of the empty chair with 2 fingers. But he did not. And yet he spoke, so they say, debt the sea will take. It is a language of melodrama, but often melodrama is a mask for precise. Who, in this room, has a debt of money of honor of the heart that is not paid? No one volunteered a ledger. Poirot's smile sweetened a degree. Do not answer now. You will reflect, and you will consider that I consider not only what you say, but what you avoid saying. Harrow cleared his throat. You have a theory already. I have mon ami, a disinclination, Poirot said amiably. It is this. I do not like the theory that the sea climbed the stairs by itself, and I like still less the theory that a voice comes from nowhere. We will leave to the poets the business of the ocean speaking. For us, it is the very simple, very human matter of a person who prepared the moment with care. He tapped the candle's cold lip in the air. A prepared breath, a prepared damp, a prepared audience. He straightened, the small figure suddenly very tall. Therefore, I say only this, and it will not please you. Last night's spectacle required knowledge of the hotel, of the arrangements, and of the habits of those present. It required, perhaps, 2 small journeys to the sea, or to a place where the sea has already left its salt, and a confidence that no one would rise from their chair at the wrong moment. It did not require the cooperation of the dead. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with unspoken calculations. Poirot's expression became once more benign. Inspector Harrow will speak with you each one by one, he said lightly. After that, perhaps, I will ask the questions that are less polite. For now, I thank you. Courage. The truth comes always in its little shoes. As they dispersed, Poirot's gaze lingered just a heartbeat on Miss Vane's music folio, on the glint of Drake's watch chain, on the precise oval of Lady Evelyn's gloves, and on the damn ghost of a footprint near the service door that the porter, in his anxiety, had not yet seen. He touched Harrow's sleeve. You see, he murmured. Harrow followed his glance and hissed through his teeth. You're right. Someone used that door last night. Mais oui, Poirot said softly, and he or she thought that in the morning the sea would have taken back its voice. But the sea, it is a poor housekeeper. It leaves a little behind. He smiled very gently. And with that little we begin. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The rain had withdrawn into a sulky mist by the time Poirot and Inspector Harrow settled into the smaller reading room that had been temporarily repurposed for interviews. It was a chamber of green leather chairs, shelves lined with respectable novels no one had ever read, and a ticking mantel clock that seemed intent on making each second an audible event. Poirot, perched neatly on the edge of the chair with his notebook closed upon his knee, had angled himself so that the light from the high window fell directly upon the faces of those who sat opposite. Harrow preferred to stand by the fireplace, silent but watchful, the occasional flick of his pencil the only sign of thought. Lady Evelyn Markham was the first to be called. She entered without hesitation, her dove-gray gloves smooth and her gaze serene. She took her seat with the air of a woman, receiving visitors for tea rather than answering questions about a death. "Lady Evelyn," Poirot began, "you have known Monsieur Armitage for some years, yes?" "Known is perhaps too strong," she replied evenly. "We met on occasion. I found him pleasant company, but we were not close. Yet you invited him to the séance." Her lips curved faintly. "I invited Mrs. Blackwell to conduct a séance, M. Poirot. Mr. Armitage chose to attend of his own volition. And what did you think of his presence in such an event?" She tilted her head. "I thought it curious. He was not the sort of man to be seduced by mysticism, but he seemed intent on speaking to someone, though he did not say whom." Poirot watched her carefully. "And the phrase we heard, the debt the sea will take, did it mean anything to you?" Her pause was delicate, deliberate. "I thought at first it was some parlor trick, but it was unpleasantly specific, was it not?" "It was," Poirot agreed softly. "And yet, madam, your hands, perfectly gloved, did not tighten when the words were spoken. You looked directly at the empty chair." "I do not scare easily," she said, rising as if to conclude the matter. "But if you think I killed a man, M. Poirot, you are wasting your time." Poirot inclined his head in polite dismissal, but his eyes lingered on the faint trace of salt at the hem of her skirt as she left. Colin Drake followed, filling the room with the smell of cologne and the faint creak of expensive leather shoes. He flopped into the chair opposite Poirot with the ease of a man who made himself comfortable everywhere. "You've already had my story twice over, Inspector," he said to Harrow. "Armitage and I were friendly acquaintances. We spoke occasionally, nothing more. And yet," Poirot interjected gently, "you sat beside the empty chair, yes?" Drake hesitated. "Yes. What of it?" "You would have been the one to see if anything at all, was placed there during the séance." Drake gave a quick shake of the head. "Nothing. The handkerchief business. Well, it must have been there from the start." "Must it?" Poirot asked mildly. "And the damp at your cuffs, monsieur, still from the decanter?" Drake's grin wavered. "Yes. Clumsy of me." Poirot leaned forward just enough to make the moment intimate. "Monsieur Drake, in my experience, clumsiness often hides intention. The spilt drink, the stumble, the dropped glove, it gives one the excuse to touch what one wishes to touch. I asked myself, did you wish to touch that chair?" "I touched nothing," Drake said quickly. "And I've no interest in ghost stories, if that's what you're implying." "Perhaps not ghosts," Poirot murmured. "But debts? Those can interest anyone." Drake blinked. "What debts?" "That," Poirot said, "is for me to discover." Miss Clara Vane entered next, her music folio pressed to her chest as though it might serve as a shield. She looked younger in the morning light, but the shadow of unease had not left her eyes. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began kindly, "you were perhaps the most disturbed by the voice last night." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It reminded me of my father. He drowned when I was a child." "That is very sad," Poirot said with genuine softness. "And perhaps why you do not like the sea." "I hate it," she admitted. "I came here for work, not for pleasure. The hotel hired me to play in the lounge for guests. I don't belong in séances." "And yet you attended," Poirot said gently. "Why?" She hesitated. "Mrs. Blackwell said it would be entertaining, and Lady Evelyn insisted I should join. It would be improper to have a circle with an empty chair." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Improper, mademoiselle, or suspicious?" "I don't know," she said quickly. "I only know I didn't want to be there." "And during the sitting, you noticed a candle flame bend toward the empty chair." She nodded. It was strange. There was no draft. "Except perhaps," Poirot suggested, "from a breath, someone leaning ever so slightly forward." Her eyes flickered away. "Maybe. I wasn't watching everyone." Poirot let the silence stretch before asking, "And your music, did you bring it with you last night?" "Yes," she said. "I always have it with me." I was practicing before dinner. Practicing, Poirot repeated softly, his gaze resting on the folio. A useful thing to have on one's lap. It can hide the smallest movement of the hands. She rose abruptly. I've told you everything I know. When she had gone, Harrow closed the door and looked at Poirot. Well, Poirot smoothed his mustache thoughtfully. Lady Evelyn avoids admitting what she knows. Monsieur Drake resists too quickly, which is always a sign of the man who fears he will find the one thing he has not yet invented a story for. And Mademoiselle Vane, she hides something small, but it is not perhaps the murder. It is something of her own. You think one of them put the water there? Harrow asked. Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. Mon ami, I think someone put more than water. They put the idea, the picture, in every mind present. Once the idea is there, the rest is easy. As they prepared for the next round of questioning, Poirot glanced toward the corridor beyond the reading room. Before we continue, he said, we will visit the service door. There is a footprint I wish to examine before it is wiped away by good housekeeping. And if it's gone? Harrow asked. Poirot gave a small shrug. Then we shall know that our murderer or our mischief maker is still thinking about their work. Outside, in the mist-softened light, the service door stood shut against a narrow lane. A faint smear of salt remained near the threshold, and upon the lowest board of the door itself, a fresh scratch, no longer than a finger, caught the inspector's eye. Poirot bent, studying it closely. Voila, the mark of a key, hurriedly used, perhaps in the dark. Tell me, mon ami, does every guest of the Seaforth carry such a key? No, Harrow said. Only staff. And the manager. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then, my dear inspector, our circle has just grown smaller, and far more interesting. Chapter 6, The First False Lead. By the time the next witness was called, the mist had thickened outside the hotel's tall windows, pressing against the glass as though curious to overhear. The reading room had grown warmer from the constant fire, but the warmth did not touch the air between Poirot and Inspector Harrow. Both men had shifted from the initial courtesy of collaboration to the more exact, sharper rhythm of investigation. Harrow alert for something tangible, Poirot content to let intangibles suggest their shape. Captain Julian North entered with the slow tread of a man accustomed to being announced. He saluted Harrow, not as a subordinate, but as a fellow officer in a different theater, then took the seat opposite Poirot, placing his cap neatly upon his knee. Monsieur le Capitaine, Poirot began, inclining his head, you have seen the sea in its many moods, and see, pa? I've seen more than I care to remember, North replied. It's a hard mistress. And last night, when the voice spoke of the sea taking a debt, did it seem to you the sort of poetry a seaman would use? North frowned. It had the ring of superstition. Sailors have a saying, the sea always pays herself. Could have been drawn from that. You were seated between Lady Evelyn and Mr. Penrith. Poirot continued. Did either of them release your hand during the sitting? No, North said flatly. We kept a circle. Poirot tapped his fingertips together. And yet you did not look at the candle when it guttered. I had no interest in tricks, North replied. I kept my eyes forward. Harrow interjected. Where were you before the séance began? In the lounge, North said, reading a newspaper. I went directly from there to the drawing room when summoned. Poirot's gaze lingered a moment too long. And after the séance? Straight to my room. I don't hold with these entertainments. When North had gone, Harrow leaned on the mantel. Not much to go on there. Au contraire, Poirot murmured. He is a man of discipline. But discipline can be a mask as much as it is a virtue. We note him, mon ami, but we do not yet pursue. The next to be summoned was Mr. Penrith, the manager. He arrived with his ledger under one arm, as though the interview were merely an extension of his duties. Mr. Penrith, Harrow began, we'd like to clarify your movements last night. Penrith smoothed the edge of the ledger. I was in the lobby until shortly before 8. Mrs. Blackwell requested additional candles. I had the porter fetch them and deliver them to the drawing room. I joined the séance at Lady Evelyn's request. To make up the number, Poirot tilted his head. Do you often take part in such affairs? Never before, Penrith said stiffly. But as manager, one tries to please. And after the seance ended, I spoke briefly with the guests, then returned to the desk. There was a complaint about a dripping noise in the second-floor corridor. I sent the porter to investigate. While the porter was gone, where were you? In my office. I did not leave. Poirot's dark eyes sharpened. You have a key to the service door, yes? I do, Penrith admitted, as do all senior staff. Harrow shifted his weight. And would any guest have access to that key? No, Penrith said, his voice quickening. It is kept on a hook in my office, where only I and the head porter may reach it. Poirot sat back, smoothing an imaginary crease in his sleeve. And yet the service door was open last night. Penrith's complexion paled. That is troubling. Troubling, yes, Poirot agreed softly. And it will trouble you more, I think, when we learn who made use of it. When the door closed behind Penrith, Harrow gave a short, satisfied nod. If the key was in his office and he had it, then he's our man. Poirot's mustache twitched faintly. You leap, mon ami. Sometimes the leap lands you in the water. The possession of a key does not mean the use of it. But it's motive enough, Harrow argued. Protecting the hotel's reputation, avoiding scandal. He could have staged the whole thing, voice, water, everything, to distract from some other trouble. Poirot considered this without haste. It is possible, but see how quickly he was disturbed at the mention of the door. A man who is guilty will often try to appear untroubled or overcompensate. Penrith did neither. He was honestly dismayed. Harrow gave a noncommittal grunt. We'll keep him in mind. By late morning, the interviews had created a narrowing of possibilities in Harrow's mind. Penrith's access to the key and opportunity to open the service door had placed him squarely at the top of the list. He moved through the hotel with the faint eagerness of a man who believes he has his quarry. Poirot, however, seemed content to drift. He took a measured stroll through the service corridor, pausing at the faint smear of salt on the skirting board, then studied the brass keyhole of the door with the fascination of a jeweler examining a flawed stone. At length he straightened. Come, mon ami, he said. We shall look at the ledger. The hotel ledger was a neat, square book in which each page bore the day's arrivals and departures in Penrith's tidy hand. Poirot turned the pages until he reached the date of Armitage's arrival. There, Poirot murmured, pointing to an entry. Do you see? Harrow leaned over. Armitage, yes. Room 212. Arrived 3 days ago. And just above, Poirot said softly, Captain Julian North. Arrived the same day. From London. And Our Lady Evelyn? From the same train. Harrow frowned. Coincidence. Coincidence, Poirot repeated, as though weighing the word. Sometimes it is the alibi of fate. But note also, Mr. Drake arrived the day after. And Mademoiselle Vane? She has been here 2 weeks. This is her place of work. Harrow tapped the page. Still doesn't change the fact that Penrith had the key. None, Poirot said, closing the ledger gently. But it changes who had reason to use it. They returned to the reading room just as Penrith reappeared, flustered, a small brass key in hand. I thought you should know, he said. I've just checked the hook in my office. The service door key was not there this morning. Harrow's brows shot up. And you didn't notice before? It should have been there after I locked up last night. I assumed, well, I didn't think to check until now. Poirot's gaze rested on the key. And where did you find it? In the top drawer of the reception desk. Penrith said, That is irregular. Trace irregular, Poirot said softly. For it means someone not only used it, but returned it, which tells us, mon ami, that the user was confident enough to believe no one would think to look. Harrow's satisfaction from earlier dimmed. Then it could have been any staff member. Or, Poirot said delicately, anyone who had caused to visit the desk, to lean over, to open a drawer in pretense of seeking paper or pen or a letter. And you have someone in mind? Poirot allowed himself the smallest of smiles. I have the shape of someone in mind. But the face, we must be careful before we paint it. As Penrith withdrew, Harrow gave a low whistle. So much for our neat little theory. Poirot nodded. Yes, mon ami. It was neat, and neatness is always suspicious in life. We must look now for the untidy truth beneath. And somewhere, beneath the polite chatter in the lounge and the steady fall of the mist, the untidy truth waited, like the sea itself, ready to rise without warning. Chapter 7, The Psychological Game. The mist had thickened into a white curtain outside, erasing the headland from view and pressing the world into the confines of the Seaforth Hotel. In the reading room, Poirot had settled back into his chair with the air of a man who was not merely questioning suspects, but arranging pieces on an invisible chessboard. Inspector Harrow, arms folded by the mantel, watched with a mix of curiosity and skepticism as Poirot summoned the next guest. Mrs. Theodora Blackwell entered as though the room had been waiting for her. She wore a dove-colored silk blouse and a long skirt of deepest plum. Her presence seemed to carry a faint trace of sandalwood. She did not so much sit as arrange herself in the chair opposite Poirot, folding her hands lightly in her lap. Madam. Poirot began with that gentle courtesy that often preceded his sharpest remarks. You are an artist of the unseen. You create an atmosphere, a stage, and, how do you say, you draw the attention of your audience precisely where you wish it. Mrs. Blackwell's lips curved faintly. You make me sound like a conjurer, Poirot, I assure you, I work only with what is given to me. Poirot inclined his head. But of course. And yet last night, in your drawing room, there were two things given that were unexpected. The voice and the water. The voice, she said slowly, was not mine. The water, how could I be responsible for that? Poirot's eyes rested on her with calm intensity. In my experience, madam, the question is rarely whether one could be responsible, but whether one wished to appear so, or to appear innocent of it. She regarded him for a long moment. And you think I wish to appear guilty? I think, Poirot said softly, that in a room where 8 people sit holding hands, it is possible to create an effect while leaving no obvious trace. For example, a handkerchief placed upon a chair, or a breath directed at a candle flame from a most particular angle. Her gaze sharpened. You suggest I would risk my reputation for a parlor trick? Non, madam. I suggest that for some people, the trick is not the end. It is the means. A distraction, perhaps. An alibi. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Tell me, before last night, had you spoken privately with Monsieur Armitage? She hesitated. Just a fraction, but enough for Poirot to note it. Briefly, he expressed interest in my work. He was polite. Did he mention a debt? Her brows lifted. No. But may people come to me seeking to hear from those they believe they owe something to, or are owed something by? It is the nature of my calling. Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, and the nature of mine is to discover which debts are the spirit, and which are the very material world. Mrs. Blackwell rose gracefully, but Poirot's eyes followed her until the door closed. When she was gone, Harrow stepped forward. You think she staged it? Poirot's mustache twitched. I think she knows more than she says. But I also think, if she is a hand behind the scene, it is not for the reason we would first imagine, and that mon ami makes her either more dangerous or entirely innocent. The next to be called was Lady Evelyn. She returned with her calm, studied poise, but Poirot altered his approach. Lady Evelyn, he said pleasantly, we have spoken of the seance. Now let us speak of the sea. She inclined her head. A romantic subject, but I fail to see its connection. Ah, but the sea is not romantic to everyone, Poirot said. It is dangerous, yes? It swallows fortunes. It swallows men. Do you know Brindlesea well? Well enough, she said cautiously. My family had a summer house here when I was a child. And Monsieur Armitage? Did he ever visit such a house? She paused, the faintest tightening around her mouth. Not to my knowledge. Yet you did not appear surprised when he attended the seance. Her eyes met his without wavering. I am not in the habit of showing surprise. Poirot's gaze flicked briefly to her gloves. And yet, madam, I think there was a moment last night when you were surprised, but not by the voice. By something else. Perhaps the sudden knowledge that the performance you had expected would not go as planned. Her lips pressed together. If you are suggesting I had any part in his death, you are quite mistaken. Poirot's smile did not change, but something in his eyes grew more thoughtful. Madam, I do not yet suggest anything. I merely note the little things, the way the eyes move, the way the breath changes when certain words are spoken. Sometimes these are the footprints in the sand that lead to the truth. When Lady Evelyn departed, Harold moved to the table. You're prodding them. Exactment, Poirot said. The prodding, it creates ripples. In calm water, you see nothing, but disturb it and you see what lies beneath. It was then that Poirot requested the presence of Colin Drake once more, but this time he shifted the ground entirely. Monsieur Drake, Poirot said, I will not ask you about the seance. Instead, let us speak of insurance. Drake blinked. Insurance? Yes. You have an interest in it. NSC, pa? You have made claims. Perhaps you have refused some. Drake shifted in his chair. I've had dealings, yes. Business matters. And Monsieur Armitage was an insurance man, the kind who would remember details, the kind who might know, for example, whether every claim was as straightforward as it appeared. Drake's voice was quick. My dealings were entirely proper. Poirot raised his eyebrows. Then it would not trouble you if such matters came under scrutiny. Drake's smile was tight. Not in the least. Bon, Poirot said lightly. Then we may speak again later. When the door closed, Harold gave him a sidelong look. You're baiting them. Poirot's mustache twitched upward. It is the little game, mon ami. Push here and one frowns. Push there and one sweats. Soon you know where the weakness lies. Harold nodded slowly. And whose weakness have you found? Poirot tapped his temple. Not yet the guilty mind. But I begin to see the one who is afraid, not of what they have done, but of what I might learn. Outside, the mist thickened still, as if the world itself were drawing closer to listen. And in the reading room, Poirot's invisible chessboard had begun to reveal the first pieces he meant to capture. Chapter 8, a secondary mystery. It was just after noon when the rhythm of the investigation faltered, interrupted not by any dramatic cry from the lounge, but by a discreet knock at the reading room door. The young porter, Tom, stood there looking pale and uncertain, a folded scrap of paper in his hand. Beg pardon, sir, he said to Harold, but this was found under the door of room 212 just now. Miss Elsie, the maid, she was bringing up fresh towels and saw it. Poirot took the note before Harold could, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was angular and hurried, the ink blotted in one corner. Only 5 words were written, not to see. The book. He read it twice, then placed it on the table. This is interesting, mon ami. Very interesting. Harold's brow furrowed. Looks like someone trying to muddy the waters. The book? What book? Poirot tapped the note thoughtfully. Perhaps the one in Armitage's room, Tides and Navigation of the Channel. Or perhaps another entirely. But note, this was placed under the door after his death. So we must ask, who wished it to be found now? Before Harold could reply, Tom spoke again. There's something else, sir. Mrs. Blackwell's room. It's been gone through. Harold straightened. Gone through? When? Not 10 minutes ago, sir. Miss Elsie found her door ajar. Mrs. Blackwell was downstairs taking tea, and the dressing table drawers had been opened. One of her cases was unlocked. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And what was missing? Nothing obvious, sir, but there was paper scattered on the floor. Ah, Poirot murmured. So our ghostly visitor has arms and hands, and he or she searches for something they believe Mrs. Blackwell possesses. They went at once to the second floor. Mrs. Blackwell stood in the corridor, her expression a mask of composed outrage. Inspector M. Poirot, I demand to know why the security of this establishment is so lax. My personal belongings have been disturbed. Harold examined the lock. No sign of forced entry. Did you leave it unlocked? Certainly not, Mrs. Blackwell said crisply. I locked it when I came down, and the only key is in my possession. Poirot entered the room and looked around with the eyes of a man measuring more than furniture. A travel case stood open upon the bed, its contents, silk scarves, a velvet box, Several small notebooks were neatly disturbed, as though someone had pawed through them but then tried, imperfectly, to restore order. On the carpet lay a single sheet of hotel stationery, folded in half and bearing a faint rectangular outline, as if something had once been clipped to it. "Madam," Poirot asked quietly, "did you keep correspondence here?" She hesitated. "A few personal letters. Harmless enough." "Yet someone thought otherwise," Poirot said. He picked up the paper and held it to the light, where the faint impression of a few words became visible. "Ledger, storm tide, due before." The rest was lost. "Ledger again," Harold muttered. "It keeps coming up." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and always in connection with the sea. A ledger is a record of debts, financial, perhaps, but debts of other kinds also." Mrs. Blackwell's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting Mr. Armitage's death is connected to some accounting matter?" "I suggest, madam," Poirot said, "that someone believes it is, and that belief may be enough to kill." They left Mrs. Blackwell to restore her room and returned to the lounge. Poirot seated himself by the window, with a mist pressed closer than ever, and asked Harold to bring Miss Clara Vane. When the young pianist arrived, still clutching her music folio, Poirot greeted her with unusual warmth. "Mademoiselle, forgive me for troubling you again, but I must ask, when you entered the séance last night, where did you place your folio?" "On my lap," she said cautiously. "And did you remove anything from it during the sitting?" "No, I hardly moved at all." "Then perhaps you would permit me to see inside?" Poirot's tone was courteous but insistent. She opened it, revealing sheets of music neatly stacked. But among them was a folded map of the Brindlesea coast. It was marked with 2 red pencil crosses, one at the harbor, the other at a narrow inlet known locally as St. Bride's Cove. Harold raised an eyebrow. "And what's this doing here?" Miss Vane's color rose. "It belonged to my father. I've kept it for years. I brought it with me when I came to work here. I go there sometimes to think." Poirot studied her face. "And did you go there yesterday?" A pause, and "Yes, before dinner. I walked down to the cove. It was almost low tide." "And did you meet anyone there?" She shook her head quickly. "No one. It was empty." Poirot leaned back, fingers steepled. "So, the cove, the sea, the ledger, and now a note telling us not to think of the sea at all, but of the book. Mon ami," he said to Harold, "we have beginning of another thread, one that tangles itself with the first. And Mrs. Blackwell's room being searched?" Harold asked. "That," Poirot said, "tells us our murderer is not content to wait. He, or she, fears something will be discovered, and fear, Inspector, will always make them clumsy." Just then, Penrith appeared in the doorway, pale and tight-lipped. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, "but one of the housemaids has just reported something most alarming. The master key to the guest rooms is missing." Harold's head snapped up. "When was it last seen?" "This morning," Penrith said. "It should be in the key cupboard, but it isn't." Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes gleamed. First the service door, now the master key. Our thief, or our murderer, moves with boldness. And boldness, mon ami, is dangerous, for it tempts one to act before mind has time to prepare the perfect crime. He rose, smoothing his cuffs. "We must move quickly, for I think this new theft is not the beginning of something, but the end." Chapter 9, Hidden Connections. The news of the missing master key moved through the Seaford Hotel with the stealth and speed of a draft under a closed door. Guests leaned closer over their teacups. The staff moved in pairs rather than alone, and a subtle tightening seemed to creep into every corridor. Poirot, however, was unusually still. He had taken up a position in the lounge near the fire, his fingertips resting lightly together, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Harold recognized the look. It was the expression of a man whose mind was walking ahead of the conversation. "Penrith," Harold said, turning to the anxious manager who brought the news, "I want every door locked and accounted for, and send for the head chambermaid. She's to check each guest room." Discreetly, "Yes, Inspector," Penrith murmured and hurried away. Poirot rose then, brushing a speck of imaginary dust from his cuff. "Mon ami," he said quietly to Harrow. "Do you see how the pattern begins to form?" The service door key was used, returned, and hidden in plain sight. Now the master key is taken. These are not the actions of one who improvises. This is preparation. Harrow's frown deepened. Preparation for what? Poirot's voice was mild. For a visit, a room to be entered without notice. A search or a removal. They moved into quieter corridor by the writing desk, with a rain-streaked windows through a watery light across the floorboards. Poirot stopped suddenly, his gaze falling to the hotel blotter, where Drake had sat the previous evening. The blotter had been replaced with a fresh one, but the page beneath bore the ghost of yesterday's impressions. He lifted it to the light, tilting it until faint indentations emerged. Ledger, meeting, St. Bride's. The last word was underlined twice. Drake, Harrow muttered, and the same cove marked on Miss Vane's map. Just so, Poirot said. And what does one do at a secluded cove, mon ami? One meets without witnesses. One exchanges what? Money, perhaps, or something one wishes to keep from prying eyes. As they spoke, Tom the porter appeared at the far end of the hall, clearly looking for them. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Harrow, "but you'd best come to pantry. There's been, well, I don't quite know how to put it." The pantry, when they arrived, smelled sharply of salt and cold metal. On the counter lay a small canvas bag, still damp, its drawstring crusted with crystals. Beside it, on a saucer, rested a brass key, the missing master key. "Found it tucked behind the flour bin," the cook explained, arms folded across her ample chest. "Whoever left it there didn't want it found quick." Harrow picked up the bag carefully. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were several ledger sheets, tide tables by the look of them, and one smaller, older notebook bound in cracked leather. The notebook was stiff from damp, and when Harrow opened it, the faint smell of the sea rose from its pages. Poirot leaned in. "Regard as the handwriting here. It is the same as an Armitage's unfinished letter." This was his. The pages were filled with notations, dates, names, amounts. Some entries were crossed through, others were marked with a small star. And there, halfway down a page near the middle, appeared a name both men recognized. Colin Drake, next to some considerable size. Harrow gave a low whistle. "So that's the debt." Poirot nodded slowly. "A debt, but perhaps not in the sense we first thought. See, there are other names. Some we do not know. One, however," he turned a few pages, tapped a line with his forefinger. "Lady Evelyn Markham." Harrow stared. "They're all in it, or all owed something to Monsieur Armitage." Poirot said softly, "And a debt owed can be a chain, Inspector. To be free of it, one may cut the chain or the man who holds it." Before they could examine further, Penrith reappeared, breathless. "There's something else," he said. "Mrs. Blackwell has just reported that someone attempted to enter her room again, not 20 minutes after you left her. The lock was scratched." "Eh bien," Poirot murmured. "The master key was needed for more than one door." Harrow shut the ledger firmly. "Right. We're holding this in my keeping from now on." Poirot looked at him gravely. "Guard it well, mon ami. But remember, it is not the ledger alone they fear. It is what it proves. This little book has turned our stage of polite society into an assembly of potential murderers." They returned to the lounge to find Miss Vane seated at the piano, playing without sheet music, her eyes downcast. Poirot approached, resting one hand lightly on the edge of the instrument. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you know St. Bride's Cove." She froze, fingers pausing on the keys. "I told you I walked there. And you know also," Poirot continued, "that Monsieur Drake goes there. Perhaps you saw him? Perhaps even Monsieur Armitage?" Her eyes flickered upward, then away. "I didn't see anyone." Poirot's voice was kind, but unyielding. "Mademoiselle, when one is in danger, sometimes one lies to protect oneself. But sometimes to remain silent is more dangerous still." She pressed her lips together, then said in a low voice, "I saw them, Drake and Mr. Armitage. They were arguing when—" Harrow demanded. "The evening before the séance." Near the rocks at the cove. I was further up the path. I don't think they saw me. Drake was saying something about settling it before the tide turned. Mr. Armitage told him he'd had enough chances. And you told no one? Harrow asked sharply. I didn't want to be involved. Poirot's eyes were thoughtful. But you are involved, mademoiselle. You were in that room last night, and you heard the voice speak of a debt. Miss Vane's hands trembled on the keys. I didn't kill him. Poirot gave a small, almost sorrowful smile. Perhaps not. But you have shown us that Monsieur Armitage's death did not come only from the shadows. It came from the cove, from the ledger, from the past. And those, mon ami, he said to Harrow, are connections we must follow. The mist outside thickened again, as if the sea were leaning closer to the shore, listening. And inside the Seaforth, the circle of those bound by the ledger and by the truth had grown uncomfortably small. Chapter 10, Poirot's Secret Clue. The fog outside had thickened to a pale, breathing wall, wrapping the Seaforth Hotel in a muffled stillness. Somewhere beyond the white curtain the tide was turning, though the sound of it was faint, an occasional dull break on the shingle that seemed to come from far away. Inside, however, Poirot moved with an unhurried precision that gave the impression he was listening to another tide entirely, one of events and intentions, slowly drawing toward a decisive moment. Harrow was at the mantel in the lounge, leafing through the damp, salt-stiff notebook recovered from the pantry. He glanced up to see Poirot studying the fire, as if the flames might arrange themselves into a confession. You've gone quiet, Harrow said. That's either very good or very bad. Poirot's gaze remained on flames. It is very delicate, mon ami. We have before us a room full of people bound by a ledger of debts. We have a murder. Yes, I call it murder now, with the sea as its little stage decoration. And we have this new fact. Someone was bold enough to take the master key, to search, and to return it. Boldness, I have told you, can be dangerous, but it can also be foolish. Harrow raised an eyebrow. And you spotted their mistake? Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps, but it is a small mistake, so small one must be looking for it. And for now, I keep it here. He tapped his temple. When I use it, it will be at the exact moment it will do the most good. The inspector frowned. If you've got something... Patience, Poirot interrupted gently. We must let the little drama play its final act. But to do so, I require a little scene of my own. Before Harrow could question him further, Penrith approached. Poirot, Inspector, there's been another incident. In the writing room. You had better see it. The writing room was dim, its tall windows a blur of fog. Upon the central desk, a sheet of paper lay in plain view, weighted by an inkwell. On it were 4 words, hastily written in a hand neither neat nor careful. It will be gone. Harrow scowled. Gone? What will... Penrith shook his head. The paper wasn't there an hour ago. Several guests passed through to fetch letters, but no one saw who left it. Poirot bent over the page. The paper is hotel stationery. The pen, the common one from the desk. But the ink, it is still damp along the edges. This was written within minutes. He looked up. Mon ami, the person who wrote this is telling us that something, perhaps the ledger, will vanish. And yet, by telling us, they risk stopping it. This is curious. Harrow muttered. Or it's a bluff, a way to keep us watching the wrong thing. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Exactly, which is why I will watch the wrong thing very visibly. And in the meantime, I will watch the right thing invisibly. He left the note where it was. But as they stepped into the corridor, he slowed, eyes drawn to the carpet runner. There, near the service stairs, a faint thread of coarse fiber clung to the edge, pale, frayed at one end. Poirot stooped, plucked it delicately, and examined it between forefinger and thumb. Aha, he said softly. From the hem of a coat, perhaps, or from the lining of a case. And here, he gestured to a slight depression in the pile, the ghost of a half-moon shape. A mark from a heel, one with a small chip missing on the inside edge. That, Inspector, is the footprint of a lady's shoe. Mrs. Blackwell? Lady Evelyn? Miss Vane? Harrow asked. Poirot only shrugged. It is one of the little details I collect. Later, when I put them together, they will form the picture. They returned to the lounge, where Mrs. Blackwell was seated near the fire, speaking in low tones to Lady Evelyn. Miss Vane had taken up her usual place at the piano, though she was not playing, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Drake stood by the window, peering out into the fog as though he could see more than whiteness. Poirot made a little circuit of the room, speaking briefly to each. To Lady Evelyn, he remarked upon the quality of her gloves. To Drake, he asked about fishing tides. To Mrs. Blackwell, he inquired after her recovered belongings. And to Miss Vane, he observed the difficulty of keeping a piano in tune near the sea. Harrow, watching, began to realize that Poirot's questions were not casual at all. They were chosen to unsettle, to plant thoughts, to measure reactions. At last, Poirot stood by the fire and said pleasantly, "Mesdames et messieurs, I must ask for your indulgence. There is something missing, something which, if it disappears entirely, will be a loss to us all. Therefore, I shall remain here this afternoon in plain sight to guard it. You may come and go as you wish. I ask only that you do not approach the writing room." There were puzzled looks, but no protest. Harrow gave Poirot a sidelong glance, understanding the gambit. Make the object seem protected, and if the thief could not resist, they would betray themselves in the attempt. The hours passed slowly. Guests drifted in and out of the lounge, their conversations muted, glances flickering toward the writing-room door down the corridor. At one point, Poirot excused himself to speak quietly to Penrith, who then went into the room and emerged again, locking it behind him. It was near 5 o'clock when the moment came. Miss Vane rose from the piano, murmured something about tea, and walked toward the far door, not the one leading to the dining area, but the side corridor toward the writing room. Drake, at the window, turned just enough to watch her go. Lady Evelyn's eyes followed, but her head did not move. Poirot, without looking directly, took a small step toward the corridor. The sound of the latch turning carried clearly in the muffled hotel air. Then silence. When Miss Vane reappeared, her face was pale, but her movements were careful, composed. She crossed the lounge without speaking and resumed her seat, hands folded in her lap. Poirot gave her a genial nod, then leaned toward Harrow. "You see, mon ami," he murmured, "sometimes a fish swims directly into the net when the water is made just a little cloudy." Harrow's voice was low. "You think she went for the ledger?" Poirot's eyes were unreadable. "Perhaps. Or perhaps for something else entirely. But what she touched, that I will not say yet. That I keep for the right moment." He moved toward the fire again, his mind clearly elsewhere. He had the clue he needed, the small, exact detail that would tip the balance. But like a man playing the final moves of a chess game, he was content to wait until every piece was in position before delivering the checkmate. Outside, the fog thickened once more, and the tide crept higher against the shore. Inside, the game continued, its next turn already forming in Poirot's mind. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. By the next morning, the air in the Seaforth Hotel had taken on the flavor of a place where politeness was wearing thin. The fog had settled in heavy layers outside, muting the light, so that the day seemed reluctant to begin at all. Inside, the guests who once moved with the gracious unself-consciousness of leisure now glanced over shoulders, paused before entering rooms, and lowered their voices when others drew near. Poirot, dressed immaculately in a dark suit and carrying a small notebook, made a leisurely circuit of the lounge after breakfast. Harrow followed, not entirely sharing Poirot's unhurried mood. The inspector had seen the way the guests were beginning to react to one another, coldness from Lady Evelyn toward Drake, Drake's muttered asides to Mrs. Blackwell, the way Miss Vane avoided everyone's gaze altogether. The atmosphere was ripening for quarrel. It came sooner than Harrow expected. Drake was standing at the mantel, recounting in a low but forceful tone to Mrs. Blackwell how certain people were making free with wild accusations when Lady Evelyn entered. She crossed the room with deliberate grace and stopped in front of him. "If you have something to say, Mr. Drake," she said, her voice as smooth as glass, "I suggest you say it to the inspector, not to anyone who will listen." Drake's eyebrows rose. "You mean to the Belgian gentleman? I've nothing to hide from him, but I don't care for having my name dragged into every whispered conversation." You were seen, Lady Evelyn said flatly, arguing with Mr. Armitage the day before he died. The room went still. Even Mrs. Blackwell, who normally radiated calm control, sat straighter. Drake gave a sharp laugh. Is that what this is about? I was discussing a business matter. And unless the law now prosecutes conversations, I'll thank you to keep your insinuations to yourself. Business matters, Lady Evelyn repeated, her tone faintly mocking. A convenient phrase when one wishes to hide the truth. Miss Vane, who had been seated near the window, suddenly spoke. You weren't just talking. I was at St. Bride's Cove that evening. You were shouting. Drake rounded on her. Eavesdropping, were you? A bad habit, Miss Vane. Her hands twisted in her lap. I didn't want to hear, but I couldn't help it. You said, settle it before the tide turns. And Mr. Armitage told you you'd had enough chances. Drake's complexion flushed. And you've twisted that into something sinister. Well done. Mrs. Blackwell's eyes moved from one to the other. Perhaps, Mr. Drake, you should explain precisely what was to be settled. Drake's mouth opened, but before he could speak, Captain North entered the lounge and came to a halt, sensing the tension. His gray eyes flicked between the faces. What's all this? Mr. Drake, Lady Evelyn said, without looking at North, was just about to explain his conversation with the late Mr. Armitage. I don't have to explain anything, Drake said, his voice rising. And I certainly don't answer to a room full of amateur detectives. That, Poirot's voice cut in, quiet yet commanding, is true, Monsieur Drake. You answer only to the truth. But in my experience, it is better to offer the truth before it is drawn from you. How do you say? Like a tooth. The tension broke slightly as all eyes shifted to Poirot. He stepped further into the room, glancing briefly at Harrow, who had remained silent, letting the quarrel play itself out. Mess Amos, Poirot said. These little conflicts, they're useful for me. When the surface is disturbed, what lies beneath begins to rise. I see now how easily the word debt provokes you all. And I see also that the ledger, whether of money or conscience, binds more than one of you. Drake muttered something under his breath, but Poirot ignored it. Instead, he turned to Miss Vane. Mademoiselle, when you spoke just now, it was without hesitation. Yet yesterday, you hesitated to tell me the same thing. What has changed? Her cheeks colored. I'm tired of being afraid. Poirot's gaze rested on her. That is good. Fear, it is the ally of the guilty. The innocent must put aside. Lady Evelyn rose, smoothing her skirt. If you have finished, M. Poirot, I have no wish to linger in a room where I am subjected to thinly veiled accusations. Not accusations, madam, Poirot said pleasantly. Merely observations. When she had gone, Mrs. Blackwell leaned toward Poirot. You enjoy this, don't you? Watching us snap at each other. Poirot's mustache lifted slightly. Enjoy? None. But it is necessary. In the calm, everyone wears a mask. In the storm, the mask may slip. After the others dispersed, Harrow joined Poirot by the fire. You're stirring them up. Oui, Poirot said simply. It is time. The one who fears discovery will begin to make errors. And the more the others speak, the less room there is for that person to maneuver. Who is it you're pushing? Harrow asked. Poirot gave a small shrug. Perhaps more than one. But there is one mon ami who is very close to the edge. When they fall, it will be with a sound we cannot mistake. They left the lounge together, walking toward the corridor that led past the writing room. The fog pressed against the windows, making the hall seem narrower, more enclosed. Poirot slowed suddenly, his eyes on the carpet runner. There, almost invisible, was another faint half-moon mark, the same as he had seen before, accompanied now by a second, smaller indentation, as though someone had turned quickly on their heel. He bent a look, murmuring, "The lady's shoe again, and she was not alone this time." Harrow glanced toward the far end of the corridor, where the service door stood closed. You think they're meeting? Poirot straightened. Not meeting, plotting. And soon, mon ami, they will act. From somewhere down the hall came the muted sound of a door closing. Poirot's gaze sharpened. The game, he knew, was about to shift into its next and more dangerous phase. Chapter 12, The Confrontation. The fog had thickened again by late afternoon, so that the Seaford Hotel seemed to float in a pale void, cut off from the headland and the sea alike. Lamps had been lit early, and their light fell in warm pools along the corridors, creating pockets of brightness between stretches of shadow. Poirot, who had been unusually quiet since the tense scene in the lounge that morning, now moved with a purpose that Harrow recognized. The slow, deliberate pace of a man who had chosen his moment. It began in the small morning room, where Mrs. Blackwell had taken refuge with a book she was not reading. Poirot entered without announcement, closing the door behind him with a gentle click. "Madam," he said, "I have been considering the curious matter of the ledger. Not the sea, you understand, nor even the chair, but the ledger. A simple book, and yet it has the power to create storms." She looked up, her expression composed. "You believe I have it?" "I believe you have looked for it," Poirot replied. "Twice, and failed." Her mouth curved slightly. "If I had been looking, M. Poirot, I should not have failed." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "And yet the master key was taken. Your lock was scratched. A search was made. You did not report the second attempt until you were certain you could use the knowledge to your advantage." Her eyes narrowed. "You're very sure of yourself." "I am sure," Poirot said, "that you are a woman who understands leverage. And the ledger, madam, is leverage of the most dangerous kind." He let the silence stretch, then added, "It is a pity you do not know that it has already been found." For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or calculation, passed over her features. But Poirot only inclined his head and left her with the fire hissing softly in the grate. He found Harrow in the corridor outside the writing room. "You've got something," the inspector said, reading it in Poirot's expression. "Oui," Poirot said. "It is time to put pressure on another. When you squeeze an orange, mon ami, the juice will tell you what is inside." The orange he chose next was Colin Drake, found in the smoking room with a newspaper folded but unread in front of him. Harrow stood near the door as Poirot approached the table. "Monsieur Drake," Poirot began pleasantly, "you have been most patient with my questions, but there is one I have not yet asked. On the night before the séance, at St. Bride's Cove, what did you give to Monsieur Armitage?" Drake's head came up sharply. "Give him? Nothing." Poirot's voice remained mild. "Then what did you try to take back?" Drake gave a short, derisive laugh. "This is ridiculous." "And yet," Poirot said, "Miss Vane heard you speak of settling something before the tide turned. I have walked the cove, monsieur. There is a small shelf of rock where one might leave an object, safe from the water until the tide covers it again. What was left there, and why did Armitage refuse you?" Drake's eyes darted toward Harrow, then back to Poirot. "It was nothing important." "Then you will not mind telling us." He hesitated, and in that hesitation Poirot leaned forward just enough to make the moment intimate. "Monsieur Drake, you are a man of business, but the ledger in Armitage's possession contained your name. A sum was written beside it. To owe a debt is one thing. To have the record of it in another man's hands is quite another. Tell me, did you fear he would use it?" Drake's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill him." Poirot smiled faintly. "You answer only the question you wish to answer. That is interesting." Before Drake could respond, the door opened and Captain North entered. He paused on seeing the tableau, then said, "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all, mon capitaine," Poirot said smoothly. "In fact, you arrive at a most opportune moment." North glanced between them. "Then perhaps I should hear what's being said." Drake pushed back his chair abruptly. "You'll hear nothing from me." He brushed past North and left the room. North raised an eyebrow. "Trouble?" "Only conversation," Poirot replied. "But conversation, it can be most revealing." When North had gone, Harrow turned to Poirot. "Well, did he give anything away?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Oh, yes." He confirmed that the ledger frightens him. "And fear, mon ami, is the most reliable witness of all." They walked together toward the staircase, the fog pressing at the windows like a silent audience. Poirot slowed at the landing, glancing toward the far corridor where the service door lay. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we must be watchful. I think the one who searches will search again, perhaps for the last time, and when they do, we shall be there to see it." Harrow studied him. "You think they'll go for the ledger?" "Not for the ledger," Poirot said, "but for something that was with it. Something small, perhaps overlooked when it was first taken. And in reaching for it, they will reveal themselves." He looked out into the white blur beyond the glass, his reflection sharp in the lamplight. A murderer, mon ami, is like the tide. It comes in quietly at first, unnoticed, until you find it surrounded you. But there's always a sound, a movement, before the final wave. Somewhere below, a door closed, followed by the faintest echo of footsteps retreating toward the back of the hotel. Poirot's eyes met Harrow's. The moment, he knew, was drawing near. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The evening closed in early under a sky the color lead, the fog thickening until the world beyond the sea fort's windows might have been erased entirely. The sea's voice, muted all day, began to murmur again long, low rolls that were felt in the floorboards more than they were heard. It was the kind of weather that invited secrecy, swallowing the sound of a single pair of footsteps as surely as it hit a ship at sea. Poirot and Harrow had taken up a watch in the manager's office. The door left ajar, so they could see the stretch of corridor leading toward the service door. A single lamp on the desk cast a circle of yellow light, leaving the corners in shadow. The salt-stained ledger lay in Harrow's satchel on the desk, locked and clasped, though Poirot had already assured the inspector that the object of interest of the night was not that which we guard, but that which the murderer believes we have forgotten. "Explain it again," Harrow said in a low voice. "We keep watch here, but you think they'll go after something else?" Poirot inclined his head. "Exactment. A killer often leaves behind a thread, a token, something that points to them. In the rush to stage Monsieur Armitage's death, they did not have time to remove it, but they will not be able to rest knowing it may yet be found." Shortly after 9, the faint sound of movement reached them, a floorboard creaking at the far end of the corridor. Harrow leaned forward, eyes narrowing. A figure emerged from the dimness. Miss Clara Vane, her head down, her music folio tucked beneath one arm. She walked quickly, glancing once behind her before disappearing into a narrow side passage that led toward the service stairs. Harrow moved to follow, but Poirot raised a hand. "Attend. There will be another." And there was. Barely a minute later, Colin Drake appeared from the opposite direction. He moved more cautiously, pausing at each doorway, as if making certain no one observed him. He, too, turned down the side passage. Harrow's mouth tightened. "Together?" "Non," Poirot murmured. "By arrangement, perhaps, or by design of one alone, and the other to intervene." They slipped silently from the office, following at a careful distance. The service passage was narrow, lit by a single bulb that threw a dull halo on the worn boards. The air here was colder, carrying the faint tang of salt from the door at the far end. From beyond that door came the muffled sound of voices, low, urgent. Poirot's hand pressed lightly to the wood, feeling the vibration. He gestured for Harrow to move to the opposite side. "You've got no right," Miss Vane's voice was saying, sharp with fear. "I've every right," Drake hissed. "You were there, you saw it. You know what's in that ledger, and you'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." "I'm not helping you," she said. "I only wanted—" Her words were cut off by the metallic scrape of the door latch. Harrow moved, shoving the door inward. Drake straightened sharply, his face paling at the sight of them. Miss Vane stepped back, clutching the folio to her chest. "What exactly are you doing out here?" Harrow demanded. "Fresh air," Drake said at once. "Nothing more." In this fog, Harrow's gaze went to the small oilskin pouch on the floor, beside Drake's feet. "And what's that?" "Mine," Miss Vane said quickly. "I dropped it." Poirot stepped forward, picking up the pouch with delicate fingers. It was damp and smelled faintly of brine. He opened it, revealing a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay a silver fob watch, its case engraved with the initials P.A. Harrow glanced at Poirot. "Armitage's." "Mais oui," Poirot said softly. "The missing watch, reported absent from his room after his death." He turned to Miss Vane. "Mademoiselle, You have carried this since when? Her eyes flickered, and she said nothing. It was in the cove, wasn't it? Poirot went on, his voice calm but unyielding, hidden where the tide would wash away any trace. But someone, he looked at Drake, wished to remove it before it was found. This is nonsense, Drake snapped. I didn't even know. Ah, but you did, Poirot said gently, because the watch is the one thing that proves Monsieur Armitage met someone at the cove before he died, and it is not the property of Mademoiselle Vane. It was in her keeping only because she came upon it. Miss Vane's voice rose. I heard them arguing. I was afraid someone would blame me, so I took it. I was going to give it to you, truly, but then she nodded toward Drake, told me to hand it over to him instead. Harrow stepped between them. That's enough. Both of you will come back inside. As they herded the pair toward the main corridor, Poirot leaned toward Harrow. You see? The guilty one cannot bear to leave behind a trace. The watch may not be the weapon, but it is the key to the scene. And now we know who feared it most. Harrow's eyes narrowed. You think it's Drake? Poirot only smiled faintly. We are close, mon ami, but the net must be drawn in all at once. One more night, and the tide will turn, both for the sea and for our murderer. Behind them, the fog pressed against the windows, and the slow pulse of the tide sounded like the measured beating of a clock, counting down to the moment when the last pretense would fail. Chapter 14, the final piece falls into place. The night settled over the Seaforth Hotel like a heavy curtain, the fog pressing close against the windows, turning every lamplit pane into a mirror. Inside, the corridors lay hushed, broken only by the occasional muted clink from the kitchen, or the whisper of footsteps along the carpet. Harrow's uniform boots made no sound as he and Poirot walked slowly toward a lounge, both deep in thought after the confrontation at the service door. Drake and Miss Vane had been separated. Miss Vane taken to the morning room, Drake to the smoking room, each under the discreet watch of a constable summoned from the village. Neither had spoken further, though both had worn expressions that hinted their silence was less from composure than from calculation. Harrow finally broke the quiet. We've got him, Poirot. Drake's been cornered. The watch proves he went to the cove after Armitage, and that ledger entry ties him straight to motive. Poirot's eyes half closed, as though he were examining an inner diagram. You think so, mon ami? But then, why take the watch now? The danger of its discovery was already great. Why increase it? No, it is not so simple. Harrow frowned. You think he's covering for someone? Poirot shook his head. I think he is protecting himself, yes, but perhaps from something more subtle than the watch. That object is a key, but it may open a door to more than one room. They entered the lounge to find Mrs. Blackwell and Lady Evelyn seated together by the fire, their posture outwardly relaxed, but their eyes following every movement. Poirot gave them both a pleasant nod, then drifted toward the writing desk. His gaze lingered on the fresh blotter, the neat row of pens, and the small brass tray of envelopes. One envelope was smudged faintly along the edge, as though a damp finger had held it. He picked it up delicately. The paper had been folded sharply, then opened again. There was no writing inside, but the faint outline of something rectangular could be seen pressed into its surface, a thin shape, perhaps a calling card or photograph, once placed there long enough to leave its ghost. Poirot's fingers traced it gently. Another little absence, he murmured. Harrow approached. Something missing? Poirot replaced the envelope exactly as he had found it. Perhaps the thing our murderer returned for last night was not the watch alone. Perhaps they sought a second keepsake, a piece of paper, a card, small enough to hide, but dangerous enough to risk everything for. From the far side of the room, Lady Evelyn spoke. Poirot, is it your habit to inspect every scrap of hotel stationery as though it were a clue to a murder? Poirot turned, smiling. Madam, in my experience, murder often hides in the smallest folds of paper. Her gaze met his, unflinching. And have you found my name written there? Poirot gave a small bow. Not yet, madam, but one must keep looking. After she turned back to her conversation with Mrs. Blackwell, Poirot murmured to Harrow, It is in the reactions, you see. A guilty one seeks to know how much I have seen. An innocent one does not care. They left the lounge and made their way upstairs, where the second-floor corridor was dim and quiet. Poirot paused outside room 212, Armitage's room. Harrow unlocked it, and they stepped inside. The chair where Armitage had been found sat precisely where it had been returned, its upholstery faintly darkened where salt water had once stained it. Poirot moved around it slowly, then knelt, inspecting the underside once more. His fingertips found a small ridge in the cloth where it had been retacked, newer than the rest. He pressed it, and the fabric gave way slightly. With delicate care, he drew out a folded slip of paper, brittle at the edges from damp. It bore only 3 words, written in a steady hand: North. Storm tide. Harrow's eyes widened. Captain North? Oui, Poirot said quietly. And the storm tide, it is not a poetic phrase. It is a time when the water rises highest, covering the cove completely. If one wished to hide something there or retrieve it, one must know precisely when the tide turns. That explains the tide tables in the ledger, Harrow said. But what does North gain by killing Armitage? Poirot stood, slipping the note into his pocket. That, mon ami, we must allow him to tell us, though perhaps he will do so without meaning to. They returned downstairs to find Captain North himself entering from the vestibule, his coat damp at the shoulders, his cap in hand. He paused on seeing them. Evening. I took a walk to clear my head. This place feels close with all the questions flying about. A walk in this fog? Harrow asked. North shrugged. I've walked in worse. Poirot's eyes rested on the small chip at the inside edge of his right shoe's heel, the same shape he had seen impressed in the carpet days before. Ah, but you are used to navigating when visibility is poor, n'est-ce pas? And the tide, you would know it well. North's gaze sharpened slightly. If you're suggesting... Poirot lifted a hand. I suggest nothing yet, but perhaps tomorrow, MES Amos, we will have a little gathering. All who were in the séance will attend. We will speak of the empty chair, the ledger, the cove, the watch, and, most important, the storm tide. North gave a short, humorless laugh. Sounds like you made up your mind already. Poirot smiled faintly. Oh no, Captain, I do not make up my mind. I allow the facts to do it for me. And now I think they are ready. When North had gone, Harrow leaned close. So he's the one? Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the corridor where North had disappeared. He is the one, or he wishes to seem the one. Tomorrow will tell us which. The final piece, mon ami, is almost in place. And once it is, he tapped his temple. The picture will be clear to all. Outside, the fog thickened still, the tide pushing higher, as though the sea itself were preparing to attend Poirot's gathering. Inside, the guests moved with an air of quiet expectancy, and in the air there was a sense, not yet spoken aloud, that the long waiting was nearly over. Chapter 15, The Final Gathering. Morning came reluctantly, dragging a gray light to the fog as though it had to push its way inside the Seaforth Hotel. The sea was invisible, but its presence was felt in the low hum beneath the floorboards and the faint tang in the air. Guests rose early, though few lingered in the breakfast room. They knew, by whisper or by direct summons from Harrow, that Poirot had called for all to assemble in the lounge at 10 o'clock. The room had been arranged with precision that was unmistakably Poirot's doing. 8 chairs in a half-circle faced the fire, their positions subtly echoing the layout from the séance. The empty chair from that night, now placed in the center. A small table beside Poirot's seat held the salt-stiff ledger, the silver watch, and the brittle slip of paper marked North. Storm tide. By the time the mantel clock struck 10, they had all arrived. Lady Evelyn, poised as ever, took a seat where the light from the tall windows caught her profile. Mrs. Blackwell arranged her skirts and folded her hands, her gaze sweeping the room as though assessing her audience. Colin Drake entered last, his jaw set, a cigar case in hand, though he did not open it. Miss Vane sat near the end of the row, clutching her music folio, while Captain North, stiff-backed, took the chair nearest the fire. Penrith hovered by the door, uncertain whether he belonged to the assembly or the staff. Harrow stood near the mantel, arms crossed, ready to step in if required. Poirot rose, smoothing his cuffs. Mesdames, Messrs, I thank you for joining me. We have been together now for several days in this charming hotel, but alas, our time has been colored by a most serious matter, the death of Monsieur Armitage. His gaze swept the row of faces. At first, one might believe it an act of nature, his heart, perhaps, stopped by no human hand. But very quickly, the little details began to tell another story. The salt water where no sea should be, the voice that spoke in the seance, the handkerchief upon the empty chair. These were not the work of spirits, no matter how talented Madame Blackwell may be. Mrs. Blackwell inclined her head slightly, a controlled acknowledgment. Poirot continued, the death was deliberate, and, as in all such matters, we must ask, who had the motive, who had the opportunity, and, most subtle of all, who had the imagination to dress the crime in such curious clothing? He stepped toward the table, resting a hand on the ledger. This book is a key. Within it, Monsieur Armitage recorded debts, some financial, some of a different nature. The names within it connect nearly everyone here. Monsieur Drake, your name appears beside a sum, one not insignificant. Lady Evelyn, yours also, with a note that speaks of a matter unresolved these many years. Mademoiselle Vane, your father's dealings are recorded here, linked to the harbor and to certain shipping matters Captain North would know well. North's jaw tightened. Such a ledger, Poirot said, is a dangerous thing. In the hands of a man like Armitage, it becomes a weapon. To remove it, or to remove him, would be to rid oneself of that danger. Drake leaned forward. So you're saying any of us could have wanted him gone? Just so, Poirot replied, but only one did. And to discover who, we must consider the curious matter of the cove. He picked up the silver watch. The evening before his death, Monsieur Armitage met someone at St. Bride's Cove. We know this from the testimony of Mademoiselle Vane, who overheard part of their conversation. We know also that the watch was left there, whether dropped or placed deliberately, and we know that the tide was an important consideration. Settle it before the tide turns, were the words heard. His gaze shifted to Captain North. You, mon capitaine, are a man of tides. And in the chair where Monsieur Armitage died, I found this slip of paper, your name and the word Storm Tide. This is not coincidence. You knew precisely when the coal would be covered, and you could use that knowledge to conceal or retrieve what you wished. North's eyes flashed. Are you accusing me outright? Not yet, Poirot said softly, for there is still the matter of the service door. It was open with a key not normally in the hands of guests. Someone took it, used it, returned it, and later took the master key as well. These actions speak of a person with boldness and with knowledge of the hotel's workings. They also speak of someone who feared a certain object might be found, someone willing to risk a second search. That second search led to recovery of the watch, but I suspect the true object was something else. A small card, perhaps, or a note like the one found under Monsieur Armitage. He let the silence stretch. Lady Evelyn's gloved hands rested perfectly still, but her eyes were sharp. Mrs. Blackwell's composure was unbroken. Drake's fingers drummed once on his knee. Miss Vane stared at the floor. Poirot went on. Last night, we interrupted Monsieur Drake and Mademoiselle Vane at the service door. This was instructive. It told me who was willing to take possession of the watch, and who was willing to pass it to another. But the watch is only one piece of the puzzle. The final piece, Amias Amos, is the identity of the person Monsieur Armitage went to meet at the cove. He moved to the empty chair. On the night of the seance, this was a seat. Yet he was not in it. Instead, his voice was heard, his voice, or one made it sound like it, speaking of a debt and of the sea. This, I believe, was not only theater. It was a warning from the killer to another. Keep silent, or the tide will take you as it took him. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. And so, when I reveal that person, it will be clear why the voice was heard at all and why, for the murderer, the final act of this little drama must be played today. The room was utterly still. Harrow's gaze moved from one suspect to the next, gauging the tightening of jaws, the flickers in the eyes, the slight shifts in posture. Poirot inclined his head. But for that, Miss Amos, we must proceed to the last step. You will remain here, please, while I prepare. When we next speak, the matter will be ended. With that, he turned toward the door, his small figure precise and self-contained, leaving behind a lounge filled with the heavy silence of people who know the moment they have been dreading is at last upon them. Chapter 16, The Reveal. When Poirot returned to the lounge, it was as though the fog itself had followed him in, bringing with it a damp chill that seemed to settle over the assembled company. The clock on the mantel ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, marking the seconds between each measured step as he crossed his place beside the empty chair. Harrow stood near the fire, his eyes flicking from one suspect to another, reading the tension etched into their faces. Poirot placed both hands lightly on the back of the empty chair, his gaze traveling along the row of guests. "Mess Amos," he began softly, "we have arrived at the moment when the little gray cells are satisfied. The threads, so tangled, so knotted, are now drawn together into a pattern that is clear to me. I will tell you how Monsieur Armitage died, and by whose hand." He nodded toward the small table where the ledger, the watch, and the slip of paper lay. "These are our principal actors, more truthful than any witness. The ledger, with its list of debts, gave motive to more than one among you. The watch, found hidden in the cove, placed a living person at the scene with the victim shortly before his death. And this slip of paper, North, storm tide, told me the time and place the killer chose for concealment." Poirot's eyes rested briefly on Captain North. It was easy, perhaps too easy, to see the seaman's knowledge his guilt. But no, mon capitaine, you were not the one who lured Armitage to the cove. You were merely a name used as part of another's plan, knowing it would cast suspicion upon you should the paper be found. North exhaled sharply, his knuckles easing on the arms of his chair. Poirot continued. "The killer required 3 things. First, to meet Armitage in a place where their conversation could not be overheard. Second, to stage the séance so that his death appeared to occur while he was elsewhere. And third, to plant elements of mystery, salt water, a voice, a handkerchief, to confuse the investigation and give the appearance of supernatural agency." He turned toward Mrs. Blackwell. "Madam, you provided the perfect stage. Yet you did not know that one of your guests intended to use it for more than a demonstration of spiritualism. Indeed, your skill was used against you." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Poirot's voice deepened. "The murderer also had access to the service door, to move unseen from the séance to the victim's room and back. This required opportunity and knowledge of the hotel's layout, knowledge possessed by someone who had been here many times before." Now his gaze shifted to Lady Evelyn. "You, madam, knew the Seaforth well from childhood. You knew where the service door led, how the corridors connected, and how quickly one could move from the drawing room to room 212 without being noticed." Lady Evelyn's expression did not change, but a faint tension appeared at the corner of her mouth. "You had a debt recorded in the ledger," Poirot went on, "one you could not afford to see exposed. Monsieur Armitage's arrival here was not by chance. He came to collect, perhaps in money, perhaps in some other currency of influence. He arranged to meet you at St. Bride's Cove before the séance. You took the master key from the desk earlier that day, so that you could later enter his room unseen." Harrow's eyes flicked to Lady Evelyn, but Poirot did not pause. At the cove, words were exchanged. The watch fell or was taken, and left behind as you returned to prepare for séance. During the sitting, you arranged for the empty chair to be in a place where you could approach it unnoticed. The candle flame that bent was from your breath, as you leaned forward to place a handkerchief damp with seawater upon the seat. The voice, recorded beforehand or spoken by an accomplice, delivered its message to frighten another into silence. And when all eyes were on the circle, you left by excuse or in the darkness, through the service door to Armitage's room, where you end his life quietly, perhaps with a swift pressure to the chest or a subtle poison already in his drink. Poirot's gaze was steady now. Then, the salt water, carried up in a hidden vessel, was poured at his feet, the scene arranged, and you returned before the séance concluded. Later, you attempted to recover the watch and a second item from his possessions, a card or note linking you more directly to the debt, but the police were already near to finding them. Lady Evelyn's voice, when it came, was calm but cold. "You have constructed a very pretty story, M. Poirot, but it is still a story." Poirot inclined his head. "Non, madam, it is a pattern of facts. The half-moon imprint of your shoe was seen in the service corridor. The salt stain on the hem of your skirt matched the time you returned from the cove. The envelope in the writing room bore the faint imprint of a card that once bore your name alongside Armitage's. For the first time, her eyes faltered. Poirot's tone softened, but it did not lose its certainty. You killed him because he was a man who dealt in leverage, and he had chosen to use yours. You fear not only financial ruin, but exposure to something older, more private, something you would do anything to keep buried. And so, like the tide that erases footprints from the sand, you sought to erase him. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the ticking of the clock. Then Harrow stepped forward. "Lady Evelyn Markham, I must ask you to come with me." She rose with deliberate grace, her chin high, though her voice trembled slightly when she said, "You will find, Inspector, that the tide comes in again tomorrow, no matter what is taken from the shore." As Harrow escorted her from the lounge, Poirot returned to the empty chair, resting his hand upon it. "You see, Miss Amos, there is always an empty seat at the table of truth, but in time it is filled." The others sat in uneasy quiet, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them. Outside, the fog began to thin, and somewhere beyond it the sea whispered over the shingle, the tide turning once more. Chapter 17, The Tide Recedes. The following morning broke pale and cold, as though the night's events had leached the color from the very air. Mist still clung stubbornly to the headland, but it had thinned enough to reveal the restless shimmer of the tide beyond the harbor wall. Poirot stood at the window of the Seaforth's dining room, his coffee untouched, watching the slow retreat of the water from the shingle. The dining room was almost empty. Only a handful of guests lingered over breakfast. Their voices were hushed, the clink of cutlery subdued. Every so often, eyes would lift Poirot, then flick quickly away, as though afraid that meeting his gaze might draw forth some unspoken truth. At the far table, Mrs. Blackwell arranged her teacup with mechanical precision, while Captain North sat opposite her, his weathered hands folded before him. Neither spoke. Inspector Harrow entered quietly, the damp from outside still on his coat. He crossed to Poirot, taking the chair opposite. "She hasn't spoken since last night," he said in a low voice. "Not to me, not to anyone. Solicitor will arrive by noon. There's enough to charge her, I'll grant you, but there's still something that doesn't quite sit right." Poirot's gaze remained on the tide. "Ah, mon ami, there is always something in such matters. The truth, like the sea, is never entirely still. It may withdraw, but it leaves behind traces, shells, driftwood, a glint of something half buried in sand." Harrow frowned. "You mean there's more?" Poirot turned from the window. "I mean that the facts, while sufficient for law, may yet conceal a deeper current. Consider, why the theatrics of the séance? Why the damp handkerchief, the whispered voice? If the goal was merely to silence Armitage, a quieter method would have served. Non, mon cher, these were layers, meant to suggest not only mystery, but fear." The inspector tapped his fingers on the table. "Fear in who?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, "in more than one person." He leaned forward. "You have spoken with the others this morning?" "Briefly," Harrow replied. "Mrs. Blackwell insists she knew nothing, though she's shaken to the core. North says you want to get back to sea before the tide turns again. And young Miss Penrose has been keeping to her room, claims she's feeling unwell." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Unwell or avoiding conversation? He sat back, folding his arms. "I should like to speak with her before she departs. There is something about her account of the séance that troubles me. She heard the voice most clearly, yes?" Harrow nodded, said it was close to her ear. "Just so," Poirot murmured. "And yet, when I examined the arrangement of the chairs, her position was not near the hidden speaking tube in the wall. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Before Harrow could answer, the dining-room door opened and Miss Penrose herself entered. She looked pale, her hair hastily pinned, her hands clasped tightly before her. On seeing Poirot, she hesitated, then made her way to a table near the corner. Poirot rose at once and crossed to her. "Mademoiselle, forgive the intrusion, but may I join you?" She nodded, though her eyes did not quite meet his. "You have had a difficult night. Poirot began gently. Such events are not easily put aside. She gave a small, brittle laugh. I suppose not. It's just, I can't stop hearing that voice. Indeed, Poirot said. It was most unnerving. And you were closest to it, were you not? Her brow furrowed. I suppose so. I don't know. Poirot tilted his head. And yet, you told me last night there was a man's voice, low, with a trace of an accent. Such details suggest you heard it very distinctly. Miss Penrose's fingers tightened on her teacup. Yes, but she stopped, biting her lip. But, Poirot prompted softly. She glanced around the room, then lowered her voice. I don't think Lady Evelyn meant for him to die. I think it was supposed to be a warning, not... Harrow, who had drawn closer, leaned in. What do you mean, a warning? Miss Penrose shook her head quickly. I've said too much. Please, just leave it. I'm going home on the afternoon train. Poirot's eyes searched hers for a long moment, but she would say no more. He inclined his head. As you wish, mademoiselle. But remember, the tide may conceal a thing for a time, yet it always returns what is taken. She looked away, her lips pressed tightly together. When Poirot returned to his seat with Harrow, the inspector muttered, Well, that was as clear as mud. Poirot smiled faintly. Non, it was very clear indeed. Our mademoiselle has knowledge she fears to speak, knowledge that suggests a second hand in this matter, perhaps unseen but no less real. And until we find that hand, I think we must consider that the tide has not finished its work. Harrow leaned back, studying the detective. So you're saying it's not over? Poirot looked once more to the sea beyond the window, where the water's edge retreated, revealing dark lines of weed and the glint of wet stone. No, mon ami, it is only that the tide is going out. It will return. Chapter 18. The Final Current. By late afternoon the mist had gone, leaving the harbor sharp-edged under a pale, wintry sun. The tide had come in again, a slow, deliberate swell that lapped against the sea wall with a steady, almost expectant rhythm. Poirot stood at the edge of the pier, his mustache twitching slightly in the breeze, while Inspector Harrow approached with the news that Lady Evelyn's solicitor had arrived and was waiting in the lounge. Shall we? Harrow asked. Poirot gave a small nod. Yes, mon ami. Let us bring this tide to its turn. They found the lounge half-lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the low sun. Lady Evelyn sat in one of the high-backed chairs, her expression carved from stone. The solicitor, a thin, meticulous man with pince-nez, sat beside her. Mrs. Blackwell, Captain North, and Miss Penrose had also been summoned, each taking their places as if for some grim rehearsal. Poirot took the center of the room, his voice quiet but carrying. Mesdames et messieurs, we have come to the end. The truth, like the tide, has drawn back to reveal what lies beneath. And what lies beneath, I fear, is not the simple act of a single person, but a design with two hands upon it. Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Poirot began pacing slowly. It is true that Lady Evelyn arranged the séance. It is true she employed certain theatrical devices to unnerve Monsieur Armitage. A damp handkerchief, a hidden speaking tube, a whisper in the dark. She meant to frighten him into silence, to warn him away from a matter she considered dangerous. But murder? Non, that was never her plan. Harrow frowned. Then who? Poirot turned to Miss Penrose. It was you, mademoiselle, who sat far from the tube, yet claimed to hear the voice most clearly. Why? Because it was not the voice through the wall that reached your ear. It was one whispered directly beside you. Miss Penrose's face went white. Poirot's voice softened, but each word struck with precision. You moved in the darkness, unseen, and added to the illusion Lady Evelyn had prepared. But you also carried something more, a vial of concentrated heart tonic, easily mistaken for a harmless cordial in the dim light. When you passed a glass to Monsieur Armitage, he drank without suspicion. The shock of the séance masked the true cause of his collapse. There was a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Blackwell. But why? Poirot turned his gaze fully on Miss Penrose. Because, madam, our young mademoiselle stood to lose more than any of you if Monsieur Armitage spoke of what he knew. A small matter of forged maritime documents. Documents that would have revealed her father's role in a smuggling affair years past. The exposure would have destroyed her family's name and fortune. Miss Penrose's lips trembled. "He was going to ruin us," she whispered. "After everything, he wouldn't let it go." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "I do not excuse your act, mademoiselle, but I understand the desperation that led to it. You saw Lady Evelyn's plan as an opportunity, a moment of chaos in which you could strike without suspicion, and so you did." Harrow stepped forward, his voice firm. "Miss Penrose, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me." The girl rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the carpet. The room was silent save for the faint hiss of the tide beyond the window. When she was gone, Lady Evelyn let out a long, shuddering breath. "I want to protect him, from others and perhaps from himself. But I never—" Her voice broke and she turned away. Poirot moved to the window, watching the harbor where the water now lay smooth and full under the fading light. "The sea, madam, keeps its secrets until the moment it chooses to give them back. We can only be grateful that this time the truth has returned before it was lost forever." Harrow joined him at the window. "So the tide's turned, eh?" Poirot's eyes followed the gentle swell against the stones. "Oui, mon ami. The tide has turned, and with it the last shadow upon these waters.